Okay, so welcome everyone to this first inaugural Diversity and Inclusion Conference. This is the Indigenous panel room. Since I'm in Vernon, BC, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I am located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. My name is Sue Salamosi. I am the 2021 Executive Vice President for JCI Canada and the 2022 National President-elect. So my term starts coming up in January. I'll be moderating our panel here today along with Emma Haystein. Did I say that right, Emma?
Well done, that was very good.
Thank you. So Emma will be joining me, facilitating the question and answer period and also taking some notes as we move through the next little bit here. So originally we had 3 speakers on the panel for today. One unfortunately couldn't make it due to some weather technological issues. So we have 2 speakers today. So your guys' choice if you want to take a couple of minutes extra, if you want to spend a little bit of extra time in the Q&A period for discussion. Before I dive in, I'm going to read out Mr. John Moses's bio here to get us started. But before we do, I want to remind you to keep your microphone muted, please, during the presentations. And we'll be taking questions after the presentation. So hang on to those questions or put them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end of each presentation. So welcome, John Moses. Our first speaker on the panel today is a member of the Delaware and Upper Mohawk bands from the 6 Nations of Grand River Territory near Brantford, Ontario in Canada. He's currently the manager of Combined Object, Paper and Archaeology Conservation Treatment Labs at the Canadian Conservation Institute in Ottawa. Richard will be sharing excerpts from his late father, Russ Moses's residential school memoir, written in 1965. The Russ Moses residential school memoir recounts the author's experience at the Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School in Brantford, Ontario, which he attended under exceptionally severe wartime and post-war conditions from 1942 to 1947. John, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Yahweh. Sego Skinagawaga, Sawadis Moses, Young Gats, Ganyatse Angwahoe, Ganyatse Hodno Shoni, Ganyanga Hega Tano Lene Lenape. My name is John Moses. I'm a member of the Delaware and Upper Mohawk bands from the 6 Nations of the Grand River Territory near Brantford, Ontario, Canada, which is where both my parents were born and raised and where the majority of my extended family members continue to live and work. My father was the late Russ Moses. He was a residential school survivor, a naval veteran of the Korean War, and a public servant. My mother is Helen Montour Moses. She followed her own mother, Edith Anderson Montour, into the nursing profession, and my mother, Helen, was one of the founding members of the original National Indigenous Nurses Association of Canada back in the 1970s, for which organizational work she received her Eagle Feather. So I'm telling you all of this just so you know exactly who I am and where I'm coming from and the various experiences that have shaped my own worldview. I would like to acknowledge, of course, our Indigenous veterans and elders and the Anishinaabe traditional territory from which I'm joining you today in Ottawa. Now, my presentation this afternoon, and I wish to thank the JCI and Yvette very much for this platform, is in the spirit and intent of the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, and in the spirit of the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Now, the residential schools experience looms large in the history of my family, just as it does for so many other Indigenous families across the country. While my mother's family, the Montours, were for the most part raised at home in traditional 6 Nations family settings, things were rather different on my father's side of the family, on the Moses side of the family. My late father, Russ, and his brother and sister were raised at the Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School in Brantford in the 1940s. Their father, my grandfather, Ted Moses, was there in the 19-teens, and my great-grandfather, Nelson Moses, was raised there even earlier in the 1880s. So that makes me the first generation after 3 that was not sent there, for which I am, of course, extremely grateful. And with the Mohawk Institute having closed its doors as a residential school in 1970. Now, the following memoir was written by my father, Russ, upon his leaving the Canadian military in 1965 and starting new work that year as a civilian public servant with the then Indian Affairs branch of the Department of Citizenship and Immigration. Written from the vantage point of December 1965, when he was 33 years old, the memoir recounts Russ's childhood experiences at the Mohawk Institute, which he attended from 1942 until 1947. Each residential school was a unique subculture in its own right. Different schools met different perceived needs in different regions of the country during different decades, and different conditions applied. When my great-grandfather Nelson Moses was at the Mohawk Institute in the 1880s, it was run as a mission school where likely young men and women from the Six Nations community were sent to be trained as Indigenous Anglican clergy and teachers. My grandfather Ted was there in the 19 teens, when it was essentially a military-themed boarding school during the era of global militarization that would culminate with the outbreak of the First World War. It degenerated throughout the decades of the 1920s and 30s and the era of the Great Depression. My father and his siblings had the misfortune of being sent there during the 1940s at the height of the Second World War, by which time any pretense towards providing training or education for the children had been abandoned. The Indigenous children were there to provide the forced agricultural labor necessary to keep the large farm operation going as a contribution to the civilian food production effort on the Canadian home front during wartime. Others were sent to provide forced labor in various factories in Brantford, with the city's major farm machinery companies by then likewise having been converted to meet wartime industrial production needs. The Mohawk Institute itself sat on 350 acres of prime southern Ontario farmland with varieties of crops, livestock, and orchards under cultivation. Sadly, however, the child inmates derived no benefit from their labors, and as you will hear, they were reduced to begging on the streets of Brantford to help sustain themselves. Now, this unique first-person account is an important primary source document for an Indigenous autoethnography of the residential school's experience in Canadian history, wherein, as Indigenous peoples ourselves, we assert a leadership role in providing our own unfiltered testimonies and accounts without representation or validation or mediation by others. And since the memoir was produced in 1965 at the specific request of government officials, it obviously predates our current era of retrospection concerning the schools as the state maneuvers to contain its various liabilities. Thus, Russ's memoir is not a mere representation or interpretation of an Indigenous experience by a second or third-hand narrator. It remains an actual first-hand, first-person Indigenous account that continues to speak to us despite the passage of many decades. Now, notwithstanding the tragic circumstances of childhood abuse and neglect that are described in his memoir, as Russ's son, it's important for me to convey to all of you that my father refused to be defined by his residential school experience. While he never hid his experience, neither did he dwell upon it. Beyond his upbringing, my father was a decorated naval veteran of the Korean War, an Air Force veteran of the Cold War, and an accomplished public servant whose many achievements included being Deputy Commissioner General of the groundbreaking Indians of Canada Pavilion at Montreal's Expo 67. Most important, Russ was a loving husband, father, grandfather, father-in-law, and uncle, with a tremendous sense of humor and irony and an appreciation of the absurd, which I think is what helped him deal with so many things in life. As you listen to this memoir, I would ask you to reflect upon the following questions. In what ways was the childhood and educational experience described here different than your own, or what you might know of your own parents' or grandparents' experiences? What were some of the specific techniques used to sever bonds between siblings and to disrupt the cross-generational transmission of Indigenous cultures, heritage, and languages? And finally, how might some of the conditions described here account for the social pathologies experienced in some Indigenous families and communities today? So I'm going to start off by reading from the original Government of Canada memo by which my father was requested to produce his memoir. It's on Indian Affairs Branch, Government of Canada letterhead in a document that's dated December the 10th of 1965. So just over 50 some years ago to the day. I just realized that. Anyways, the memo begins as follows. Dear Mr. Moses, during the week beginning with January the 10th, 1966, the residential school principals from all regions will be meeting at Elliott Lake, Ontario, to discuss various aspects of residential schools. In order to bring as many viewpoints as possible to these deliberations, a selected number of Indians have been invited to submit their views, and you are one of the Indians who has been selected. We would be most grateful to you if you would put your thoughts regarding residential schools down on paper and send this to me by the end of December. Please feel free to express your views candidly. We want to benefit both from your experience and your insights, and your frankness will be appreciated. All the best to you and yours during this holiday season, and I will appreciate hearing from you at your earliest convenience. Yours sincerely, L. Jampolsky, Chief Superintendent of Vocational Training and Special Services, Indian Affairs Branch. And so my father responded several days later with a 5-page document that is simply entitled Mohawk Institute 1942 to 1947 by number 12 Boy. And that was his serial number that he was assigned when he was at the Mohawk Institute. The document itself is dated December the 28th of 1965. So from here on in, this is my father presenting his memories of that situation. First, a bit of what it was like in the good old days. In August of 1942, shortly before my 9th birthday, a series of unfortunate family circumstances made it necessary that I, along with my 7-year-old sister and an older brother, be placed in the Mohawk Institute at Brantford, Ontario. Our home life prior going to the Mohawk was considerably better than many of the other Indian children who were to be my friends in the following 5 years. At the Mush Hole, this was the name applied to the school by the Indians for many years, I found to my surprise that one of the main tasks for a new arrival was to engage in physical combat with a series of opponents. This was done by the students themselves so that you knew exactly where you stood in the social structure that existed. The food at the Institute was disgraceful. The normal diet was as follows: breakfast, 2 slices of dried bread with either jam or honey as the dressing, or oatmeal with worms, or a cornmeal porridge, which was minimal in quantity and appalling in quality. The beverage consisted of skim milk, and when you stop to consider that we were milking from 20 to 30 head of Holstein cattle daily, it seems odd that we did not ever once receive whole milk or butter during the whole time I was there. This was very strange, for on entering the Institute, our ration books for sugar and butter were turned into the management, and we were supposed to receive our fair share. We never received sugar other than Christmas morning, when we had a yearly feast of 1 shredded wheat bar with a sprinkling of brown sugar. Lunch. At the Institute, this consisted of water as the beverage. If you were a senior boy or girl, meaning grade 5 or above, you received 1.5 slices of dried bread and a main course of what we called rotten soup, with scraps of beef or vegetables in a state of decay. Dessert was restricted to nothing on most days, or perhaps an apple during the summertime. Children under the grade 5 level received 1 slice of dried bread for lunch. Supper. This consisted of 2 slices of dried bread with jam, fried potatoes, no meat, and a bun baked by the girls that we called horse buns. And every other night during the summertime, an apple. The manner in which the food was prepared did not encourage overeating. The diet remained constant and hunger was never absent. I would estimate here that 90% of the children were suffering from diet deficiency, and this was evident by the number of boils, warts, and general malaise that existed within the school population. I've seen Indian children eating from the swill barrel, picking out soggy bits of food that were intended for the pigs. At the mush hole, we had several hundred laying hens of the white leghorn variety. We received a yearly ration of 1 egg apiece. This was on Easter Sunday morning. The whole milk was separated in the barn, and the cream was then sold to a local dairy firm, the Mohawk Creamery, which I believe is still in business. All the eggs were sold as well as the chickens themselves at the end of their laying life. We never had chicken ourselves, except on a few occasions when we stole 1 or 2 and managed to roast them on a well-concealed fire in the bush. The policy of the Mohawk Institute was that both boys and girls would attend school for half days only and work the other half. This was Monday to Friday inclusive. There was no school on Saturday, so generally we worked then too. The normal work method was that the children under the grade 5 level worked in the market garden in which every type of vegetable was grown and sold. The only vegetables that were stored up for our use were potatoes, beans, and turnips of the animal fodder variety. The work was supervised by white people who were employed by the Institute, and beatings were administered at the slightest pretext. We were not treated as human beings. We were the Indian who had to become shining examples of Anglican Christianity. I have seen Indian children having their faces rubbed in human excrement. This was done by a gentleman who's now gone on to his just reward. The normal punishment for bedwetters, usually one of the smaller boys, was to have his face scrubbed in his own urine. The senior boys worked on the farm, and I mean, we worked hard. We were underfed, exhausted, ill-clad, and out in all types of weather. There's certainly something to be said for Indian stamina. At harvest time, such as potato harvest and corn harvest for cattle fodder, we older boys worked all the time and did not attend school at all. We arose at 6 a.m. each morning and went to the barn to do first chores. This included milking the cattle, feeding them, and using the curry comb and brush to keep them in good mental and physical condition. After our usual breakfast, we returned to the barn to do second chores from 8 a.m. until 9 a.m. This included cleaning the stables, watering the young livestock, and getting hay down out of the mow, as well as carrying in silage from the silo to the main barn. We also had 40 to 80 pigs to raise and slaughter, depending on the time of year. We never received pork or bacon of any kind except at Christmas, when a single slice of pork along with mashed potatoes and gravy made up our dinner. A few stale candies along with an orange and a Christmas pudding that we call dog shit made up our Christmas celebrations. The IODE, that's the International Order of Daughters of the Empire, sent us used books as gifts. Religion was pumped into us at a fast rate. There was chapel every evening and church twice on Sundays. For some years after leaving the institution, I was under the impression that my tribal affiliation was Anglican rather than Delaware. Our formal education was sadly neglected, and when a child is tired, hungry, lice-infested, and treated as subhuman, how in heaven's name do you expect to make a decent citizen out of him or her, when the formal school curriculum is the most disregarded aspect of his or her whole experience? I speak of lice. This was an accepted part of being an Indian at the Mohawk Institute. Our heads were shaved each spring. We had no toothbrushes, and no underwear or socks were issued during the summer. Our clothing was a disgrace to this country. Our so-called Sunday clothes were cut down First World War Army uniforms. Cold showers were provided summer and winter, in which we were herded en masse by some of the bigger boys, and if you didn't keep under the shower head, you would be struck with a brass-studded belt. The soap for cleaning ourselves was some sort of a green liquid chemical that just about took the hide off of you. Bullying by the larger boys was terrible. Younger boys were slaves to these fellows and were required to act as such. There were cases of homosexual contact, but this is not strange when you consider that the boys were not allowed to talk to the girls, even their own sisters, except for 15 minutes once a month when you met each other in a visiting area and then you spoke in hushed tones. Any mail coming into any student or mail being sent out was opened and read before ever getting to the addressee or to the Indian child. Any money was removed and kept by the staff. It was our practice at the Mohawk to go begging at various homes throughout Brantford. There were certain homes where we knew the people would be good to us. We would rap on the back door and our question would be, anything extra tonight? Whereupon, if we were lucky, we would be rewarded with scraps from the family table. Many children tried to run away from the institute, but nearly all were caught and brought back to face the music. We had a form of running the gauntlet in which the offender had to go through on his hands and knees through the widespread legs of all the other boys and be struck with anything at hand. This was all done under the supervision of the boys' foreman. I've seen badly injured children going through a gauntlet of 50 to 70 other boys lying in the most abject misery with not a soul to care. As I sit writing this paper, many things that have been dormant in my mind for many years are coming to the fore. This situation divides the shame amongst the churches, the Indian Affairs branch, and the Canadian public. I could write on, and someday I will tell of how things used to be. The staff at the Mohawk Institute lived very well. There's a separate dining room where they were waited on by the Indian girls, and the food, I am told, was excellent. When I was asked to do this paper, I had some misgivings, for if I were to be honest, I must tell you of how things as they were. And really, this is not my story, it's your story. There were and are some decent, honorable people employed within the system of residential schools, but they're not sufficient in number to change things. And then Russ goes on to provide suggested improvements for residential schools. Number one, religion should not be the basic curriculum. It's my feeling that non-denominational residential schools should be established. Two, more people of Indian ancestry should be encouraged to work in residential schools as they have a much better understanding of the Indian personality and would also be more likely to be trusted and respected by the students. Number three, Indian residential schools should be integrated into the broader community. They should be seen more as a group home than as an institution. Four, salaries should be paid to the staff. That should be on par with industry. Otherwise, you only tend to attract social misfits and religious zealots. Five, the Indian student should have a certain amount of physical work to do. Too much work is no good, but no work is even worse. I believe a limited amount of work gives responsibility to the individual and helps him or her develop a well-balanced personality. Six, parents of Indian children should be able to contribute to the financial upkeep of their children if it's within their means to do so. I realize this would be difficult, but at least it bears looking into. Seven, each child should be given an individual attention, get to know him or her personally, encourage leadership. This could be accomplished by giving awards or rewards for certain achievements. Eight, last but most important, solicit ideas from the students themselves. We adults don't have all the answers. In summary, the years that an Indian child spends in an Indian residential school has a very great deal to do with his or her future outlook on life. And in my own case, it showed me that Indians are different because you've made us different. And so, gentlemen, I would say to you, take pains in molding not the Indian of tomorrow, but the Canadian citizen tomorrow. And it's signed Russ Moses, number 12 boy. And again, it's dated December the 28th, 1965. So the memoir ends there. Russ's suggested improvements for residential schools at the end are noteworthy and reflective of the era in which they were written. No one, not even my father, had any expectation that the schools would be eradicated. They were an entrenched feature of Canadian society and part of the reality of being an Indigenous person in Canada at that time. Indeed, the last school did not close until 1996. So the best that one person acting on their own could do would be to make recommendations for their improvement. It's also necessary to note the relationship of the residential schools with the 60s scoop, where during the decade of the 1960s and beyond, concerted efforts were made to transfer thousands of Indigenous children to non-Indigenous families through special adoption measures. In tandem with residential schools, the 60s scoop was yet another effort by the Canadian state to disrupt Indigenous families and to eradicate the cross-generational transmission of Indigenous languages, heritage, and cultures. So what then is the moral of Russ's story? I would simply say that this is what colonialism looks like. This is what colonial violence looks like. And, you know, as some people have said, there's no spin that you can put on this. These conditions do meet the standard of what the Supreme Court of Canada itself has recognized as cultural genocide. So I'll just leave it there. As Russ himself concludes his own memoir, "This is not my story, but yours." So thank you very much for your time, Nyawe Goa, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions or have further discussions. So thank you very much, Nyawe.
Thank you, John. It was chilling. The chilling account of your father's memoir really highlights the history here in Canada. And I want to take the time to thank you for sharing it with us today so that we can learn and grow and really work towards reconciliation in this country. Thank you for your time. I'm going to introduce, thank you. I'm going to introduce Lily Miller as our next speaker, and then we're going to do a group question period right at the end, if that works for everybody. I'll bring Lily up to the screen here. Oh, perfect. Okay. So our next presentation will be from Lily Miller. Lily, if you wouldn't mind helping me pronounce a couple of these words. I'm not sure how to say them, and I don't want to say them wrong.
I'm Wolastoqey, from the Nagutgut First Nation, also known as Tobique, in the Wabanaki Confederacy.
Thank you. So Lily runs an Indigenous community group in Orleans to provide opportunities for Indigenous peoples to practice or reclaim cultural traditions and knowledge for non-Indigenous people to learn about these traditions as well. She sits on several educational advisory tables advocating for anti-racist decision-making, decolonization, and equity. And she'll be sharing a historical racism, the present day impacts and solutions. So thank you so much, Lily. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sue. My name is Lily. I have been living here on Algonquin territory since 1991. I thank Yvette for inviting me here today. I was fortunate to attend a deer hide scraping workshop last month. And it took place outdoors and the temperatures were below freezing. We had a small fire going in a portable fire pit to ease the chill for this 6-hour workshop. There was about 20 of us who were there to reclaim a tradition that was lost, or should I say stolen. The wet deer hide was draped over a smooth log. And as I scraped the fur off, I was intently aware that this thread of knowledge being shared with me at that moment had traveled thousands of years, passed through generations by elders and knowledge keepers to get to me that day. And somehow it survived. I want to pause here and as I speak, I'd like you to self-reflect on any thoughts or feelings that you have while I'm speaking. If it's negative, judgmental, skepticism, sadness. I think it's important in anti-racism work, these moments where we stop and we ask ourselves, okay, what am I feeling here? Because quite often when we talk about racism, in general, I have found that it's not intentional, and they are racist thoughts that that have just been normalized. So if you are willing to do that, and anything comes to mind, you can keep it to yourself, or you may want to share it later. But I often ask friends and people I speak to just be aware of that. So not all Indigenous knowledge survived. Some was lost. As well, many Indigenous people are disconnected from their cultures and their languages because of cultural genocide. There were laws that made it illegal to practice our cultural and spiritual traditions. Now, illegal didn't mean a knock on the door by the bylaw with a ticket. Illegal meant arrested, jailed, or even children taken from parents or worse. Much of cultural genocide was a result of residential schools. A horrific scheme by John A. Macdonald and Duncan Campbell Scott to kill the Indian and the child, quote unquote. Children were often stolen by Indian agents and RCMP. Parents were threatened if they didn't send their children to school. And in doing so, the children were traumatized, parents were traumatized, whole communities often left without that sound of children outside. The lack of laughter and the playfulness was replaced with just adults surviving. And when you think about that, you think about where does the Indigenous knowledge go? Where does the traditional knowledge go? Who is it passed on to? We're very fortunate that a lot has survived, but like I said, a lot has been lost because of that. The trauma was inflicted for generations, and the children torn from their families, beaten, starved, tortured, raped, forced to bury their friends, forced to bury or burn babies or throw them into the ocean. This is not the olden days. These are people I know whose parents have gone through this and are still affected by this. These generations are traumatized. I don't know if any of you have experienced trauma or have had therapy. Therapy is very, very expensive and is inaccessible for many people. So what do we do? Well, we relive the trauma over and over and over. So you just can't get over it. Very happy that some people, like John's father, was able to persevere in spite of what he had to endure. But many people self-medicate with alcohol or drugs. They can't maintain relationships with other people, if it's a partner, their child, or friends. So quite often when I see an Indigenous person out without a home or asking for money, I know that Canada did that. Generation after generation, horrifically traumatized, Canada did this. And the issue is that Canada is not fixing it in any impactful way. So why though? Why dehumanize Indigenous peoples? Why oppress them? Why send them to residential schools? Control. Racism and oppression is about control, controlling people means they can control the resources and the land. And that's still evident today. Really, it comes down to money and power. Oppressed people are less likely to rise up. There are some, I mean, I've seen there's always Indigenous people who do rise up, but it is a percentage of them. When Indigenous people were forcibly removed from their lands, such as right here in Ottawa, the colonizers settled in. And it's much easier on the conscience when the outgoing group are dehumanized and reduced to a single characteristic, such as dirty, alcoholic, or addict. And I'm sure you've heard these and more. Now, think about a group that is widely thought of with warmth and competence. I wonder if you can think of a group like that. I could, I won't say what mine is, but just think of the difference of what people may think of a minoritized group to this other group that is thought of warmly and with competence. So we know the purpose of the racism and the oppression served historically, but why is it so prevalent still? Why is white supremacy still alive and well? This is a question that I think it's really important to know in order to address and fight racism. I'm curious to know your thoughts on this, so perhaps you'll share this after. With the finding of the children out west from the residential mass grave, people, European descent people, say to me very genuinely, "I'm so sorry, I didn't know." They're crying, they're sad. They say, "What can I do?" I've heard some people say, "Buy Indigenous goods, support Indigenous businesses, give to Indigenous charities." And yes, that's important. But the responsibility doesn't end there. Government policies still oppress. They still force Indigenous people from their lands. They still deny them clean drinking water. They have policies that poison lakes and rivers and policies that ignore treaties. So yes, your donation is nice, but your voice is most important to stop the oppression. During the elections, I hear so many people choose their favorite candidate based on what's in it for me. And that decision centers self. But what if people made their choice based on what's best for those in our community, our society that so desperately need help? What if we made our choice based on the party that is most committed to equity? I believe when we lift up those who are most in need, our community, our society is stronger and everyone benefits. Thank you.
Really, that was very powerful and emotional, and I very, very much appreciate you sharing your time with us. I'd like to open the floor for questions and thoughts. There were a few things that Lily brought up there that she'd like to hear some thoughts on. I'll bring John back up to the screen as well. And we have about 10 people in this room, including ourselves. So if anyone has any questions, the time is, and we've got about 10 minutes before we go back to the main room. I have a couple of questions here that I can start with, if nobody wants to jump in. Okay, so first question I have, trying to bring it on my screen in front of me, but it's not working. In Canada, there are strong human rights laws and systems to address discrimination. How can we, sorry guys, one moment, sorry.
So I have them as well in front of me printed if you.
Perfect.
That's helpful.
Go for it, Emma, thank you.
Sure. So in Canada, there are strong human rights laws and systems to address discrimination. How can we enforce the laws and policies with regards to systemic racism towards Indigenous people? So if any of our speakers would like to answer the question, or if anyone in the group has anything they would like to share in answering the question.
I can dive right in, I guess. So,
Thank you, John.
well, for me, it's certainly a matter of strict enforcement, applying these strictly with the zero tolerance for non-compliance. I know that, from time to time, different situations will emerge that are reported upon in the media. And, quite often the response from the public and from various interest groups will be, well, there needs to be a law, there ought to be a law. And, I'm of the view is that we don't necessarily need more laws. We need to start enforcing the laws that are already there and applying them forcefully with, as I say, with a zero tolerance for non-compliance. So I would just leave it there as well. And, not necessarily in terms of coercive law as well, but paying attention to emerging legal principles like the legal duty to consult Aboriginal peoples, the legal duty to consult Indigenous peoples in the advance of yet the latest resource development initiative and that kind of thing. By consulting people up front, you can forestall the possibility of conflict in the future. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.
I can add,
Lily, there we go. Thank you.
I can add to that. Canada does have strong human rights laws, but to bring up a case against Canada, first of all, it's intimidating. I myself, I'm not I don't like conflict. And I think there's a lot of people like me. We just don't want to rock the boat for the most part. But then there's also, so there's the thought of just that whole legal battle, going to court, but then there's also, Canada has deep pockets. What's the point? If there's human rights laws and Canada's on the other side, what's the point? Unless so for a solution for this is, I would say, is if Canada funded the lawyers on the other side who are against them, because it's not a fair fight otherwise. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to respond within the group to that question before we move on to some other questions? No? Okay, so I'll move.
I can't hear you.
No, you are muted.
My apologies. There you go. So I'm going to move on to a question in the chat that one of our guests posted. What can we do to provide a safe space for Indigenous people to share their stories and experiences? How can we be good allies and supporters?
Yeah, again, well, I think, what we're doing this evening, well, it's the evening where I am here in Ottawa, is a perfect example in itself. I work with, the national president, Yvette. We work at the same Government of Canada organization, and it was Yvette who, just totally reached out to me and explained to me that this event was happening, and she provided me this platform to provide my father's memoir. And it's very personal for me, as you can imagine, by speaking my father's words. We are an oral history people. by sharing his words out loud with the rest of you, it's one means of keeping his memory alive. And so I appreciate that. So very basically, just the events like the kind that we're experiencing tonight is very useful and profound, I find. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Lily, do you have anything you'd like to add to that question?
Yeah, events like this are I agree, because I do feel safe here. Because there is that other side of society who aren't allies, who are ready to attack. So it is risky for people like myself to come and share and open up. The other question, how can we be good allies and supporters? That's a different question. For me, I'd say if you hear somebody say something that's not right, speak up. Like, for example, I was at a school board meeting and one of the trustees, everybody's kumbaya, we're all woke, right? And one trustee said, everything's, we're moving so fast on whatever they were talking about. You're doing good work when the pioneers have arrows in their back. And I waited because I thought there were allies there. And this is a prime example of what a good ally should have done. A good ally should have said, either in the chat or publicly, yo, you need to apologize for that. That was a microaggression. That was racist. So it's really important, if you want to be a good ally, speak up.
Thank you very much, John and Lily, for your honesty with that question and encouragement in what we can do. Does anyone else in the group have a question that's coming to mind for them, or I can move on to some other questions that I have with me? You're welcome to just raise your hand or type it in the group. Gloria, sorry, is that a question or is it applause? I'm just.
It's a question.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to know, because I was misplaced a little bit, so I don't know if anybody covered this before. I want to know, what is it that the Aboriginal national leaders are doing to ensure that there's going to be like somebody assigned on a national level who will have a position like Queen Elizabeth position, where in the future, if there's anything regarding Canada that needs to be made, they will be the first people to voice themselves or to make like the final opinion, and then having the rest of leaders across Canada to also decide. I hope you understand what I mean. Like a position, kind of like because of course in Canada we don't have presidents, but we have prime minister and Queen Elizabeth, right? Is that like, is the Aboriginal community trying to have a position like that will ensure to put them in a statute, in a position for everybody to respect them and allow them to make decisions that will affect this country, because this is their country? Because I feel like, because they are not in those positions, we're kind of going in circle of always talking about, what they went through, what they are going through. But then the changes that are happening in Canada, I feel like they are not involved in making the decisions on how Canada should go forward. They are just positioned to just follow what everybody is deciding. But this is their country. I feel like they should be the number one people to decide how this country should advance. So is there anything like that that is happening, or that they are protesting about or working on it?
John, would you like to respond? I see you unmuted.
Sure. Yeah, I think the Indigenous population is so diverse. And we should note too that when we talk about Indigenous or Aboriginal, I guess in some respects those terms are interchangeable. And Aboriginal is like, it's a legal term in Canada. Like the Aboriginal is defined at Section 35 of the Constitution Act, meaning that the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So they're right off the bat, there are those three broad groups. And of course, within each of those three, there's an enormous amount of diversity. So I think it would be virtually impossible to ever expect or anticipate that there might be one unified national voice, no more so than with the rest of Canadian society at large would we ever expect a single unified voice on anything. Just in terms of the political representation that's out there right now, I guess the big three political organizations are the Assembly of First Nations, the Métis National Council, and then the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. And then within that, like with the Assembly of First Nations, for example, there are 600 plus Indian Reserve communities across the country, but not all of those consider themselves to be part of the system that's represented by the Assembly of First Nations. A number, remain independent and they choose not to align themselves with the AFN. So I don't think we could ever expect to have a single unified voice. Like that's not the point. There's a huge amount of diversity of opinion that's reflected by regional, priorities and circumstances and that kind of thing. Where I'm from at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, historically, there's been a strong political viewpoint that we are allies directly to the British Crown and not subjects of the British Crown. And that if there's something truly important that needs to be discussed with the Six Nations Confederacy, we'll actually deal directly with the British sovereign, whether that's Queen Elizabeth II or if it's, in decades past, it was George V or whoever. We didn't even necessarily recognize the authority of the government of Canada. We saw the political relationship as being directly with the British Crown. So that's one example of how things are done in one community. So thanks.
Thank you, John. Lily, do you have any response to that question, or should we move on to another question?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that the First Nations across Turtle Island, they are nations. They are nations. They govern themselves, right? And Canada has imposed themselves in a way that is very patriarchal, but the First Nations are fighting that because they don't agree. There's no law saying that. Like here, we're on unceded Algonquin territory, right? They didn't give up this territory to Canada. So to say one voice, these are all different nations, just as you would, in Africa, all of those are different countries. It's kind of like that.
Okay. And I just want to know, so based on the different nations that currently, because I should take some time to research myself, but currently based on all different nations and community, so how is their leaders getting, let's say, involved with when it comes to Canada in general? Like, is the leaders of each nation, each community only speaking on the terms of their community, or are they also sharing decisions and opinions that involve like the whole population of Canada?
It's some of them are dealing directly with Canada, and some are unified under, like what John was saying, the Assembly of First Nations, unified there. And the Assembly of First Nations is kind of like a go-between. So they're, I guess, like an ally, you would say, if you want to compare it to something here, amplifying the voices of the First Nations and working through that tunnel, that pathway to the government to get what they need. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and like myself, I've never worked directly with the Assembly of First Nations in any capacity, but the current national chief is Roseanne Archibald, who's from a First Nation within Ontario. But I guess the way that it works is that the different local and regional chiefs will bring items of interest forward, and they will encourage the rest of the chiefs to accept these as resolutions that might be adopted and brought forward by the entire organization. So it's that kind of a political structure with the local and the regional chiefs raising up issues that might first emerge at the individual community level, and then seeing how these resonate with other chiefs and other communities elsewhere in the country, and then eventually these are adopted as AFN wide priorities, and that's how the AFN moves forward on its business. That's my understanding in a nutshell, basically.
Thank you very much, John and Lily. Gloria, do you feel content that your question was answered?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions coming up in the room? Okay, if not, I'll move on to one of the questions that we've been given as facilitators. So in JCI Canada, many members want to fight racism, but they are not stepping up because they feel awkward, are too scared to inadvertently say anything offensive. What are the mistakes to avoid doing and the words to not say to be a better and respectful ally? John, I see you've been unmuted.
Oh, I forgot to mute that. Lily, do you want to go first? Do you have anything to say?
I'll just refer back to my talk when I spoke of the real way to make a difference is through policies. All these First Nations are so controlled by government policies. And that other thing I mentioned, speak up. I really don't get offended, so I'm probably not the right person to ask that.
Mm-hmm. So, and yeah, I think like Lily really nailed it right there when she said, the best thing that allies can do are to sort of speak up on our behalf when we don't happen to be in the room, and comments are made like that one about settlers with the arrows in the back and the ridiculous things like that. It's just sort of speaking up and going forward, depending upon the situation, you might be able to say, well, I was at an Indigenous awareness gathering with the JCI group that I am active in, and I had the benefit of hearing from Lily Miller and John Moses, and I've heard firsthand what some of the histories are and what some of the current concerns are and that kind of thing. The other thing I would just point out too is very small things about language that it's very easy for people to use inadvertently or without considering the implications. One thing that's always got me when people are talking about Indigenous people, they say things like Canada's Indigenous people in the possessive. That's always gotten in the use of the possessive term. Well, we don't, Indigenous peoples don't belong to Canada. Rather, so very basic things like that, rather than saying Canada's Indigenous peoples, say things like Indigenous peoples in Canada, you know, and I would just avoid the use of the possessive phrase. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John and Lily. Piggybacking off what you were just saying, John, this is just a question coming from myself, if I may. Do either you, John, or Lily have recommendations of literature or text that could help with knowing what is the right language to use if one is not familiar, so that you can avoid using the wrong words in the wrong situations and things like that?
It's hard to pinpoint any particular source. I'm sure that, like, if you go to the website for the, you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and for the national, what is it, the National Institute for Truth and Reconciliation, they must have all sorts of links and sublinks. And the other thing we need to realize too is that certain terms, although they're not favored just sort of in everyday speech, we use them because they, for better or for worse, they continue to have a legal meaning. So Indian in Canadian law remains a legal term to the extent that there is this government legislation called the Indian Act, and within that there is a legal definition according to Canadian law as to what an Indian person is. Aboriginal, I think I'd raised that before. Aboriginal is a legally defined term within Canada's very constitution. Section 35 of the Constitution Act, you know, defines the Aboriginal peoples of Canada as comprising the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So I think now, for most academic conversation and most sort of general conversation, people have gotten in the habit of using Indigenous, which is great. And of course, there's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But Indian remains a legal term, and Aboriginal is a legal term as well. So.
And I'll note that there are people who find Indigenous too general, and they prefer you say First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. So that's not me, but I know there are some people who, so if you can say First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, and not FNMI, that would be better.
Yeah. And if you know somebody's from a specific community, like myself, again, like I find Indigenous too general, and just the same as Aboriginal. You know, it's just too general. I've introduced myself to all of you virtually now, at least anyway, so you know I'm from Six Nations, so you can just talk about saying, well, I heard this guy speak the other night, John Moses from Six Nations. And the more specific you can be, I think, about identifying people's actual communities, the better. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your responses. Are there any other questions coming up in the group? Okay, if not, I will move on to another one of our questions I have here. What are unconscious bias and microaggressions? How can we deconstruct that?
I was just noticing the time. Were we supposed to go back for 5:30? I noticed it's 5:32, or somebody's going to give you the.
Oh, my apologies. I should have mentioned we're going to be going back at 1:45.
Okay, very good. Okay.
Should I repeat that question? Would that be helpful?
No, well, I can go. Like, it was asking about unconscious bias and microaggressions. And then again, that's, well, Lily herself said it when she talked about being at that school board meeting, and that person made that weird joke, I guess they thought it was, about settlers with arrows in their backs. So I don't even know if that's a microaggression. I think that's like an aggression full on kind of thing. But yeah, currently there, you know, there can be all sorts of underhanded compliments that, you know, and this applies to any sort of BIPOC person, Black, Indigenous, or person of color. Often people will be credited, you know, people you say, well, you're a credit to your race and things like that. And you're, you know, that's, to me, those kinds of underhanded or backhanded compliments, which apparently is supposed to be a compliment, in fact, can be construed as a microaggression. And I know just recently at a workplace gathering, there had been an equity, diversity, and inclusion workshop that a number of us were delegated to attend. And it was, very time consuming and very intense and everything else like that. And then later on that week, there was another meeting on a different subject within the organization, and we unveiled, or the people who had designed the organization's corporate Christmas card for that year, somebody volunteered to do the artwork, and it was like elves on a rooftop helping Santa or something like that. And somebody, piped up and said, well, the elves are not diverse enough. And they thought they were making a joke. But to me, that was a microaggression in the sense that we've spent the entire preceding part of the week talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And, here we have somebody cracking a joke about the fictional elves are not diverse enough. And that kind of, that struck me the wrong way. I don't know if that was just me, but it certainly didn't sit well with me, as lighthearted as it was meant to be. It was like saying the 4 preceding days that week were all for naught. So.
Thank you very much, John. Lily, do you have anything you'd like to attribute to the question?
Just I grew up in Newfoundland, and their way of, I won't say everyone, but in general, my experience was, if they mock you and joke with you, it's a term of endearment. But really, it's a microaggression and it's a joke, but it's not. It's not. And it really is kind of gaslighting you to make you think that, the slurs that they use mean that they love you. Yeah, so jokes are, I guess the way to combat that, again, is just to have something in your back pocket that you'll say, like, that's not cool, not funny, something like that, just to, stop it. And if the person gets uncomfortable, maybe they won't do it again. But on a whole, how to address that? I don't know. Like, almost every company has these anti-bias programs. I don't know if they work. This is something that you have to recognize. Oh my God, I just, saw this or heard this, and I thought this way. Wait a minute. I have to challenge myself and say, no, why would I think that? Just because that person is, so-and-so, right? So it's really an internal work. Yes, I totally believe in saying do's and don'ts for those people who can't do that. But really I don't know, I really have a lot of hope for the next generation.
Thank you very much. So what I'm hearing from both of you is, at the end of the day, it's up to each of us to take personal responsibility for how we respond in a moment and the language we use and how we show up in integrity in a situation. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions? Brendan, is that a question?
Well, no, I was just saying peace, and I'll just say, since now I'm here, how grateful I am for listening. I just didn't have my camera on, but I had this in my ear the whole time I'm doing my little thing here this Saturday afternoon. And I'm just so grateful to have been present and to be a listener and learning and completely absorbing what I've learned and putting it into action. And it's in my little incubator, and I'm going to be self-aware deep inside from learning here today. And my friend is here, so I'm reiterating things to her. And as she states things, because she's not hearing, you're speaking to the matter. So it's even more powerful. And I'm so grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda.
I'll just say so much knowledge and awareness. So, and because I'm a pretty loving, cool, inclusive person, I'm white, but I grew up in Trinidad, so I'm very misunderstood. So to really hear you, it was powerful. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Brenda, and thank you for being here. Do we have any other questions in the group? I see we have about 6 minutes more. Not, I will look at bring up one of our other questions we have here. How would you explain to someone who doesn't see it what systemic racism and white privilege are? What do they look like?
I have a recent example. So I sit on several of the school boards tables. And we've been asking for years for diversity in the positions that, like teachers, decision makers, right? There's a lot of diversity in the lower paying positions, but none at the top. So at the last equity meeting, this one superintendent said, "Oh, we hired this other superintendent, very proud to welcome." She said her name. I'm like, "Oh, great," because this has been 3 years that we're talking. Okay, we're gonna hiring equity. Let's lift up minoritized peoples, right? I Google it and nothing. I don't want to hurt anybody that's white's feelings, but she's a white woman, right? And it just was very, very disappointing that with all of the, I can't, like, there's a meeting next week about this, making kids feel like they belong. And it's almost once a month they're talking about equity and diversity. And yet here's an important decision-making position. You really could not find a person of color, really? So yeah, so that's systemic. That's how I see it, is in the school system. Obviously it's in healthcare. I don't know if John has anything to add.
Sorry, I couldn't seem to, I guess I'm unmuted now. In my own case, like the organization I work for, it's actually celebrating, as of next year, 2022 is going to be its 50th anniversary. It's an organization that was founded in 1972. Come 2022, they're celebrating their 50th anniversary. And in that entire 50 years, I've only been with the organization now about 14 months. I'm the first Native person, the first Indigenous person in that organization's 50-year history that they've ever hired who's Indigenous. And this isn't some fringe outfit. This is a government of Canada federal employer within the Department of Canadian Heritage, no less. And they're planning this massive birthday party for themselves, but I'll just leave it. I'll put that on the table and leave it there, kind of thing. In 50 years, I'm the first Native person they've ever hired. So that to me would be, that would be one example of systemic work that needs to be undone. So.
Thank you, Lily and John. So we have a couple of minutes left. Does anyone else in the group have a question they'd like to raise in the last few minutes we have? Let's see. I apologize, Mr. Matthew. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your first name. I see you.
Manjeet Matthew.
Manjeet Matthew. I see you unmuted. So if you have a question, thank you.
No, I don't have a question. I just wanted to echo Brenda's wordings, like, I'm the wrong Indian sitting here. I'm just listening and learning all those things what Lily and John has mentioned. I'm so proud to be here, and a part of, all these activities. I'm past president of JCI Ottawa for 2017. And this year, I'm also part of an Indigenous organization board of director called Techno Wave. So, I am doing my best to contribute to this community by learning and, volunteering. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pamela, I see you raised your hand. It has gone now. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, hi everyone. Sorry, yeah. Okay, I'm from Europe, but of course, I have some origin in Africa and everything. So sorry for the question, but just to understand something, it's really because I joined this group just really to understand something. Okay, I was asking in the group, like in the chats, okay, we cannot use a native, and it's more used in US. And I know that for sure, everyone is different, in Africa, every community is totally different. So I totally understand that. But what will be the difference between the native and Aboriginal? Just to understand, because I'm a bit lost. Sorry.
Well, I'll jump right in. I know like down in the States, for example, the term that they use, if people aren't speaking within their respective Indigenous languages, if they're speaking in English, Native American is the term that is typically used. So,
okay.
And even like with some of the political organizations, like in the state of Alaska, the Inuit people there, like the Indigenous languages, Inuktitut, but they actually agree amongst themselves that, well, if we're speaking in English to non-Indigenous white American citizens, they actually call themselves Alaskan Eskimos in English, like they've come to that accord. So here, to use the word Eskimo within Canadian Inuit circles is frowned upon, but for better or for worse, in the state of Alaska, when their own people are speaking in English, they will identify themselves as being Alaskan Eskimo. And so it's a lot of it has to do with just different, I guess, traditions that have built up within different jurisdictions, and the history and the politics is different in the United States than it is in Canada. And that's reflected sometimes in the terms that are associated to Indigenous peoples and organizations as well. So.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Pamela, for your question. I see that it is time for us to return back to the main room. So thank you very much to Lily and John for sharing your fantastic testimonies, and from both your stories. I appreciate your courage and vulnerability in your sharing with us and being open with us today and helping all of us to really expand our vocabulary and our way of thinking. And thank you very much to everybody who came to join us in this group. I hope that it has been as beneficial for you as I know it has been for me. And I hope that you find the rest of the conference as equally beneficial. So we'll see you all back in the main room.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Emma, how to get into the main room?
Just click on leave room,
right.
Angie.
Oh, sorry, Sue.
No worries. No, just click on the leave room option.
Okay.
See you back there. Thanks, guys.
See you.
If I click on the leave button on the top, I think I'll leave the conference itself.
Okay, I'll try. I think I can remove you from the room. So hopefully, if I kick you out by accident, please just jump back on the Zoom link and we'll let you back in.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. Oh. It's telling me the same thing. It says you won't be able to rejoin the meeting, so I don't want to do that. I will find out from Yvette. We'll get you back into the main room.
No problem. I'll wait.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience.